Peace, peace, peace. Welcome to another episode of Wise the Dome TV. Today, I have a very special guest. It's always an honor to build with Dr. Gerald Horne. You guys know him from all the books and from being one of the most important intellectuals in our movement. And so, again, it's always an honor to have him on. Dr. Gerald Horne, how are you doing?
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. So I wanted to have you on to kind of have get some post-election analysis of obviously, what's going on now with Donald Trump winning the election. And so one of the first things I wanted to ask you is something that I've noticed online and just through various clips and even seeing clips of different news shows. And I saw, the one thing I wanted to ask you, because you're always able to give not only a political but a historical analysis of these things. But how does the support for Trump among certain segments of minority groups, such as like the Mexican community, reflect a broader impact of European colonialism on collective consciousness, particularly among those who emphasize their legal status in the US without acknowledging that this land was taken from indigenous peoples, many of whom were those same Mexican people who voted for Trump's ancestors? Do you think failing to recognize the United States as a settler colonial project fundamentally skews one's understanding of race, immigration, and belonging in this country?
Well, certainly it does. Speaking of which, in the New York Times of November 10th, 2024, there's an article by the writer Thomas Frank. You may know him as the author of the book, What's the Matter with Kansas? He's considered a man of the left. And yet he says that when he went to an exhibit in Washington, D.C. a few months ago and saw that on one of the exhibits was appended the phrase settler colonialism, to which he apparently objected, he knew that Mr. Trump would win because that would alienate many settlers who happen to be the majority. And so this was telling for a number of reasons. One, he's a person of the left, a person you would think would have some sensitivity or at least some sense. And then secondly, he inferentially confirms that people can't handle the truth. I mean,
Right.
Native Americans originally controlled this land in North America. At a certain point, there was a European invasion where they took the land, liquidated the indigenous, and then brought in free African labor, enslaved labor, to help make them wealthy. Now, we're not supposed to say that because it makes the settlers uncomfortable. It makes little Johnny and little Jennifer feel badly about themselves. And so, therefore, we can't not deal with truth. And if you can't deal with truth, that means you can't deal with reality. But I think that we must deal with truth. We must deal with reality. And I would say further that I'm very disappointed with part of the aftermath of this election. You might have seen the comment by Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont, quote, Democratic Socialists, so-called, where he said the problem was there's too much focus on identity politics and not enough on class. Now, first of all, I'm not sure what this term identity politics means. I hear it all the time. I presume that it might even mean Black people complaining about being shot down on the street like dogs, for example. And I assume what they mean is that you're not allowed to complain about it unless you can organize a multiracial bloc. Now, they don't tell that to the American Jewish Committee. You have to be integrated. Your ranks have to be diversified before you can raise your voice against anti-Jewish bigotry. I mean, I assume what Senator Sanders is pointing to is the fact that the Republicans got a lot of mileage out of anti-trans ads. One was quite effective, according to their spokesperson, is that they said that Kamala is in favor of they and them, Trump is in favor of you. But the problem is that since Senator Sanders is so ambiguous, you don't know what he's talking about. And I guess he doesn't want to single out this besieged trans community. So he just says identity politics. And then Senator Sanders, above all, should know that over the last 75 years, Washington has conducted a movement, quite successful movement, against left-leaning trade unions. It led to a split in the labor movement, the ousting of Harry Bridges' West Coast Longshore from the House of Labor, the purging of many progressive trade unionists on the spurious grounds that they were so-called socialists or communists. And that helps to account in no small measure for what Mr. Sanders sees as an inattention to the class question. And so he should be educating people about this instead of throwing around very ill-considered ideas. Which then brings me to the other question. The 71 million strong Trump base that voted for him includes many workers, many middle-class elements. But let's focus on the workers for a minute. So supposedly they voted for Trump because the Democrats were not sufficiently to the left. Well, why did they vote for the Green Party? Why did they vote for Cornel West if they're looking for a left-wing candidate?
Right.
And so what folks are doing, as ever, is concocting threadbare rationalizations and justifications for Euro-American backwardness. This has a long pedigree in the United States of America. You may be familiar with the concept of the mid-19th century known as squatter sovereignty. They said if settlers squatted on Native American land and there was a majority of them in favor of that, then that was kosher. That was good,
right?
Even though it was Native American land. And so there's this still extant idea that a majority of settlers, whatever they do, you can't criticize it. You can't call it deplorable, for example. You can talk about fascism a week ago. It's on the ballot. But if the person designated as a fascist prevails and supported by a majority of settler descendants, which he was, then I guess we have to accept it, for example. And an important tell is that many in the United States have justifiably pointed across the Atlantic at Israel as a settler state. If I were Israeli patriot, I would say, well, what about you folks in North America? Aren't you a settler state too? And what's interesting about these settler states is that we know that in one sense, if you combine Israel and the occupied territories, there's an Arab majority. If you just look at Israel proper, there's a 20% Arab population. Everybody who knows anything about Israel knows that in order to effectuate significant change, you not only need a majority, you need a Jewish majority. And likewise, people don't recognize that in order to effectuate change in this country, oftentimes you need a settler majority. And the times when we've been able to evade that is when there's times when there are international currents blowing favorably in our direction. Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, successful revolution of the enslaved leads to a general crisis of the entire slave system, particularly when they move diplomatically in concert with British abolitionists, helping to engender a civil war in the United States. The Lincoln government cannot prevail unless they pass an Emancipation Proclamation allowing them to recruit 200,000+ Black soldiers, the Sable Arm, which destroys slavery. But that's followed quickly by the hateful, spiteful Jim Crow U.S. apartheid system, which then meets its Waterloo in mid-20th century when the rise of a socialist camp competing for hearts and minds with U.S. imperialism and decolonizing Africa and decolonizing Caribbean, creating pressure for the United States to erode the Jim Crow system so they can better appeal to emerging Africa with its vast storehouse of wealth and natural resources. That leads to a retreat of Jim Crow, although, of course, there is a grassroots rebellion against that in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957, Central High School, where President Eisenhower had to send in federal troops to protect Black students from being mauled by their Euro-American peers, killings at Ole Miss campus when James Meredith tries to desegregate in the 1960s, a few later, showing that it was not sectional. You have Euro-American working class and middle class riots in Boston over the busing controversy, which brings me to, if you're going to make a clip or a meme, make it with this.
Mm.
Given what I've just articulated, if we are to dig ourselves out of this deep hole that we find ourselves, we not only have to learn the lessons of the past that I've just articulated. The NAACP, the largest mass organization, political organization, perhaps not if you count religious organizations, but political organizations, they need to call a conference in Ottawa, Canada for June 2025. Focus on blocking the mass deportation of at least 300,000 Haitians, it may be a 500,000 or more, and the others who are slated for mass deportation. Trump is serious about this. As a matter of fact, the investor class has been able to bid up the valuation of stocks from the prison industrial complex because they expect there to be massive government expenditures for these roundup camps, which of course can easily be used for some of us
Mm-hmm.
down the road. I say Ottawa, Canada, because we should make sure that invitations are issued to those who will have a beef with the Trump administration. The government of Cuba has an embassy there. France has an embassy there. They have a beef with Washington over tariffs. Canada has a beef. We're having it right in their backyard. Now, sadly and unfortunately, it would not surprise me at all if the NAACP would be afraid to have a conference in Canada, which
Yeah.
brings me to my second option, which is I'm suggesting and recommending that the All African People's Revolutionary Party and the African People's Socialist Party under Chairman Omali, who of course now has been convicted on spurious charges, should hold a conference in Havana,
Mm.
Cuba, international conference with a similar theme: deportation, reparations, police terror against Black people in North America, and of course, the blockade against Cuba, since they're going to host it. We need an international initiative because obviously, with this Trump election, you can't tell us a few days ago that fascism was on the ballot and then act as if we can conduct business as usual.
Right.
Just filing lawsuits when you know that the courts are controlled by the right wing, particularly the ultimate court, the U.S. Supreme Court. So we should recognize, particularly the NAACP, that the bargain they struck, the Compromise of 1954, where in return for anti-Jim Crow concessions, you throw overboard our top internationalist-minded leaders, like the multilingual Paul Robeson in the first instance. That bargain has expired. The vote on November 5th shows as much. And so unless we're going to embark on a new path, we're basically consigning our future to the garbage disposal.
Mm.
And I don't think we want to do that. I don't think we should do that, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the path we're on right now. Unless we recognize that there's a state of emergency, there's a 5-alarm fire, and that we will all be burnt to a crisp unless we embark on a new course.
Absolutely. And I mean, again, that's heavy, and I've been seeing a lot of people who I will expect that from most settlers, but I've even seen, again, some of our own people champion this as if this is a win for us, right? And I just don't understand it. And so like you mentioned the articles on settler colonialism that came out. I saw a couple of other ones where they were even attempting to make settler colonialism sound like the result of natural migration between different and it's so right, but they're literally trying to do that. But one thing that when it even comes to like this immigration reform and Trump saying like off top he's gonna deport 10 million immigrants, and when we look at which immigrants those are, right, and this whole sentiment and propagation of the great replacement theory that they've been talking about for so long, a lot of the people that shouldn't be for this, right, who are for this, think that by deporting immigrants, we are going to make it easier for ourselves as far as jobs go, right? And this narrative that blames immigrants instead of capitalism for cheap labor, maximizing profits. I mean, what would you say to those people who really feel like this immigration reform or in deportation is a good thing because that means, people will have more access to jobs instead of actually looking at the root, which is capitalism itself?
Well, uh, my next book, out in 9 or 10 months, entitled The Capital of Slavery, Washington,
Mm,
D.C., 1860 to 1865. One of the themes of this book, and actually it's been implicit in a number of books I've written, is that there's been a long-term trend of trying to engage in mass deportation of Black Americans, for
mm,
example.
mm-hmm,
This was particularly the case after the 1812 war, when Black Americans joined with the British in torching Washington, D.C. That's when the whole idea of Liberia arose, West Africa, which initially was to be a settlement for the so-called free Negroes, because they scapegoated the free Negroes
mm,
for
mm-hmm,
this, although it was mostly the enslaved. But they thought the free Negroes were a bad example because the enslaved, when they saw a free Negro, they thought that meant they could eventually be free too.
mm-hmm,
So they want to get rid of all the free Negroes, send them to Liberia. Then after Nat Turner revolt, August 1831, the idea is, no, we got to get rid of all of them,
mm-hmm.
uh, free and enslaved alike, for example. The state of Maryland, for example, had its own foreign policy. It set up its own settlement, Cape Palmas, adjacent to Liberia. For a while, it was challenging Liberia, for example. The state of Maryland. So
Wow.
Maryland had the largest free Negro population, one of the largest enslaved populations. Then, during the midst of the U.S. Civil War, I talk about this in my book on Brazil, Lincoln's trying to send us all over the place. I mean, he
Mm-hmm.
tried to send us to Brazil, to Central America, to Ecuador. Problem is, nobody would take us.
Yeah.
So that's one of the reasons we're still here. And so I would counsel these folks to recognize what I said a moment or two ago. These detention camps, they initially might be for Haitians and Mexicans, but it's not like they're going to tear them down
Right. Right.
once they are used. Uh, there has been a long-term trend of creating a so-called white homeland in
Mm,
North America. You have a whole movement in Idaho, as you know,
mm-hmm.
that's moving in that direction. And you should take it seriously when a couple of days after the election, somehow all these young Black Americans get texts about being report for slave duty. I mean,
Right.
for example,
I saw that.
you should take it seriously when a Trump lawyer, a top Trump lawyer, Mike Davis, threatens the Black woman attorney general of New York State, Letitia James, who successfully sued Mr. Trump in civil court. Uh, he says that, excuse me, I'm going to quote him because it's in the newspaper.
Mm-hmm.
You need to back off or we're going to put your fat ass in jail.
Wow.
You need to take it seriously when Mr. Trump threatens investigations of all of his political enemies. And don't think that just because he goes after Nancy Pelosi, the Obamas, the Bidens, the Clintons, that only creates conditions for them to come after you, for
Hmm.
example. In other words, this term fascism is not just some sort of intended insult. It's a reality that countries have lived through. As a matter of fact, let me share something else that has occurred to me and others. With the U.S. Supreme Court decision on immunity, basically, the Supreme Court has said that if Mr. Trump is executing the core functions of the presidency, it's presumptively constitutional.
Hmm.
The core function of the presidency involves supervision, ultimately, of the office of the Attorney General. And the Attorney General presumably can investigate, or the IRS, I mean, everybody's taxes probably have imperfections. And so when a leader in a country like this begins to talk about putting all of his bourgeois opponents in jail, well, you can imagine what's going to happen to the rest of us, for
Hmm.
example. This is a very serious situation we're facing. I guess what's happening is lack of imagination.
Hmm.
That was the line after 9/11, that the folks who ruled this country couldn't imagine, supposedly, that planes would be hijacked and flown into skyscrapers in the Pentagon. Although, of course, they did have reason to believe that, but I guess they thought that it couldn't happen. Now, the lack of imagination is people can't imagine, I guess, that fascism can descend, or more to the point, what it entails.
Yeah, I
We
know.
may be in for a rude awakening. Oh, yes, a rude awakening.
And so I guess and so when we look at the other side, right, with the Democrats and how, I know you remember the incident at one of the rallies that everybody is talking about and are kind of even looking at a turning point in the election when the pro-Palestinian protester, I'm not sure exactly what she said, but Kamala responded, um, I not now. I'm talking. Do you want Trump to
Mm,
win? Something
mm,
paraphrasing, right?
mm,
And whenever there are millions of people, I don't haven't looked at the numbers yet, but from what I've read, that there are millions of American citizens who voted in 2020 who did not vote in 2024. And then you also look at the AOC and lots of the other Dems who are either call themselves Democratic Socialists or are seen as progressive, had campaigns against Jill Stein and Butch Ware and other third party members. And so when you look at just the campaign that they ran, the Democratic Party ran, I saw a meme the other day that said, uh, the Democrats are going to look up in 2028 and 2028 election say, hey man, we need to be more racist, right? Like instead of, but when we look at the role, I guess when we look at the campaign Harris ran, and also a lot of the blame and vitriol that went to Jill Stein, Bilal Ware, Claudia De La Cruz, these people that are running these third party campaigns. What were your thoughts? Because I think even the Dems, uh, in a lot of cases, took legal action to try to keep certain people off of the ballot, right? And but then, in another hand, say we're pro democracy, right? So it's kind of like, what were your thoughts whenever you saw that, though?
Well, I spoke to this a number of times. First of all, it was not only a profound strategic blunder, it really didn't make any sense because it's almost if people are not following the logic of their own thinking. The
Mm-hmm.
logic of their own thinking is that there are only 7 states in play.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly enough, apparently the Democrats lost all 7. But in any case, I recall watching the election results on Tuesday, November 5th. Polls close 6 o'clock Central, Indiana, Kentucky. Announcement immediately that
Right.
the Republicans have won. And so I was thinking to myself, why would anybody object to a third party candidate running in Indiana and Kentucky when the polls close at 6 and less than 1 minute after 6, the result is declared? I
Right.
mean, or I was watching the results from Washington, D.C., a city that I study and visit. I think the Dems had got 90% of the vote. What would be the harm of Cornel West getting 10% of that 90%? I mean, they
Mm.
still would have gotten the electoral votes. As
Right.
you know, with this archaic contraption known as the Electoral College, it's not like you can get the most votes and still lose. The question
Hmm.
is the Electoral College. And so the Dems strategically, they don't have to worry about the ultimate popular vote total. They have to worry about the result in the Electoral College.
Right.
And so they could have won goodwill from third party supporters by not challenging the right of Cornell and Jill to be on the ballot. But I mean, I'm in Texas, for example, not right now, but I live in Texas for the most part. And everybody knows the GOP has a stranglehold over Texas, and it
Absolutely.
actually was strengthened as a result of this election. So obviously, you mentioned a few moments ago the non-voting population, which obviously doesn't see in the two major parties any entity that's speaking to their interests. Well, why not allow for a third party in the state of Texas to appeal to this non-voting bloc? And given the fact that you routinely lose Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, you routinely lose Idaho, the Dakotas, Nebraska, etc. Why not encourage a third party process?
Right.
I mean, you've been losing anyway, so it's not like they're
Right.
going to mean you lose. You're losing anyway. So as I said, a lot of what the Democrats are doing, it really doesn't make any sense. But once again, we have to take the long view. I have three different analyses,
Hmm.
historical analyses, which I'll try to summarize in a few minutes. I think I've given you the 75-year analysis. That is to
Hmm.
say, the last 75 years, the U.S. ruling class has tried to squash pro-labor movements, squash leftist movements. My recent book on the Black Panther Party deals with that. And that has created favorable conditions for the strengthening of the right. And so, therefore, if there are those looking for political alternatives, the left alternative has been squashed. They only see the right wing alternative. And of course, there's complicity and culpability for many in the Trump base because many of them went along with this. They supported the anti communist purges. Uh, when people complain about jobs leaving the United States, well, at the heyday of plants floating across the Pacific to China, the U.S. ambassador to China was Leonard Woodcock, a former leader of the United Auto Workers, for example.
Hmm.
So sometimes when people speak about this Euro-American settler working class, they act like they have no agency, that
Right.
they're palms on a chessboard, they're not in part the authors of their own misfortune. That's
Hmm.
the 75-year analysis.
Hmm.
The 250-year analysis goes back to 1776 with the slaveholders' revolt against the British Empire, led by slaveholders George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, etc. They succeed, not least because they feel Britain is moving towards abolition of slavery, and also Britain was trying to restrain the settlers from moving west, taking the land of the indigenous, with Britain subsidizing real estate speculators like George Washington, one of the largest landowners then at that
Right.
point. So that helps to create this settler colonialism, uh, which then, of course, leads to when indigenous, like the Cherokee and what is now Georgia,
Hmm.
to assimilate the settler ideology by uh, dressing like the settlers, adopting Christianity, even enslaving Africans, they still lose their land. They still have to go
Right.
because of the 500-year analysis, which is that in the 1500s, when Spain, which sponsored Columbus, was taking this hemisphere by storm, you had to be Catholic to be a settler. You had African conquistadors who converted to Catholicism in Cuba, for example.
Mm.
That's one of the differences between the Black question on the island and the Black question in North America, for example, the different historical trajectories. Martin Luther, 1517, secedes from the Roman Catholic Church for various reasons that need not detain us here. It sweeps through London by the 1530s. London wants to get in on the colonial feast, but they're in the midst of these round robin wars, religious wars with the Catholic powers, particularly Spain. Improvisationally, even though they had expelled their Jewish population at the end of the 13th century, they moved to flummox the Spanish, who, of course, were embarked on an inquisition, an anti Jewish crusade of bigotry, by incorporating the Jewish population and also those who they had been warring with, the Irish, the Scots, the Welsh, into this overarching identity politics, if you like, of whiteness, white
Mm.
supremacy,
Right.
which then expands to incorporate others who they had been warring with: British versus German, German versus Pole, Pole versus Russian, Serb versus Croat, Northern Italian versus Southern Italian. The list is endless. All of a sudden, when they cross the Atlantic, they enter into the hallowed halls of whiteness. Ultimately, the hallowed halls of whiteness are expanded to include even those who might be Persian or Lebanese, like Ralph Nader, for example, who, by the way, made an ignorant analysis akin to that of Bernie Sanders.
What did you
You
say?
can look it up.
Okay.
And and so this whiteness helps to explain what happens a few hundred years later when the Cherokees are ousted
Mm.
and their mansions, in some cases in Georgia, are turned over to Europeans fresh off the boat. I was talking to a Euro American yesterday who was telling me, growing up in Atlanta, in her backyard, she used to uncover Cherokee memorabilia.
Wow.
And this is in like recent years, for example. So obviously, what happens is that the settler colonial regime is created on the basis of white supremacy.
Hmm.
Uh, as noted, oftentimes international pressure, like the Haitian Revolution, the rise of socialism, causes a retreat of white supremacy. We don't necessarily have that today. We need to recreate it, which is why I'm counseling holding a conference in Ottawa, Canada, sponsored by the NAACP. But there's such scaredy cats, I doubt if they'll move forward. So I'm asking the African People's Socialist Party and the All African People's Revolutionary Party to have a similar conference in Havana, Cuba, no later than July 1, 2025, in order to block these impending deportations of Haitians, with the ultimate goal, if need be, is having an international movement of sanctions against
Mm.
the United States, like we had an international movement of sanctions against apartheid South Africa, which
Hmm.
ultimately caused them to fall.
Absolutely. And you know, we spoke about the millions that didn't vote, and in '56, Du Bois wrote an essay titled "Why I Won't Vote," and I saw that essay being circulated a lot this election. And some people, had so a lot of people, I guess, understood the sentiment and felt that way. Now in 2024, other people felt that, it's irresponsible to see it that way in today's time. And often, people will say, our ancestors died for the right to vote. Like this is like, like the culmination of everything that they went through was, you know, for the right to vote, right? But regardless, this title, Why I Won't Vote from Du Bois, now 2024, a lot of people, because they didn't, because they feel like the Democrat are a U.S. imperialist party. The Republicans are a U.S. imperialist party. The Democrats are more right than what a lot of people give them credit for. I would say, but the people that did stay home and the people that did feel disillusioned with the whole process, um, do you feel like they deserve the I guess backlash that they received?
I would say this. Um, I wrote a book about Du Bois, and
Hmm.
when Du
I
Bois,
have
I
it
think he
somewhere over
said
there.
he wrote that in 1956.
Yes.
That was during the height of the Red Scare, and he was complaining about the lack of diversity on the ballot. I would have counseled anybody who are alienated, understandably and justifiably, by the Democrats and Republicans to vote for Cornel West,
Hmm.
to vote for Claudia de la Cruz of the Party of Liberation and Socialism and Liberation, to vote for Dr. Jill Stein and Butch Ware,
Hmm.
because those names are on the ballot. And that's something Dr. Du Bois did not have that advantage.
Right.
I would say, however, if you still don't want to vote, just as a matter of political protest, that you're repudiating the electoral system, you want to send a message that even though there are those who see voting as a tool in the toolkit, for various reasons, you think that that tool has been overvalued and
Hmm.
needs to be devalued. And so, therefore, you're going to make this protest. If that's your way of thinking, I would also encourage you to double down on mass organizing. I think that's the least you can do, to
Hmm.
double down on mass organizing against police terror, to double down on mass organizing to stop the deportations, for example, to double down on organizing at the workplace, for example. That would be my only cautionary note.
Yeah, I agree totally, especially with those third party members that you mentioned. I think a vote for them says a lot, especially as because it seems to me, even though millions did not vote in the election, it seems that this year, this election, and maybe I have a bad memory, but I don't feel like I feel like the third parties this year received a lot more attention uh, than than in the past recently, which is why AOC and many of the Democrats felt the need to attack them. When we look at when we look at the issue of Palestine, I don't know if you saw Bill Clinton recently and what he said, but it was something to the uh, some to the effect of, yeah, I can understand, Palestinians and Arabs being frustrated, but Hamas uses them as human shields. And these are coming from people that are, quote unquote, liberal, right? And then even in Ta-Nehisi Coates' new book, The Message, who's he has never really been seen as someone, in my opinion, who has necessarily been radical. Um, Whenever he, in his third chapter, whenever he talks about Palestine, he has gotten a lot of backlash from this mainstream white liberal class. And it just this whole idea of the Democratic Party and this quote unquote strategy, just vote for them and then we can push them left, when it seems to me they are on a mission to keep going further right. I mean, what do you think about that strategy? And because it just, to me, I just don't really see it. I don't see the Democrats going left. I mean, they're uh, pro police, and I don't really see much they do for the working class. It may be a little bit better than Trump's record, but I'm not even sure. And I was at a panel about that talked about Haiti and CARICOM over the weekend, and she actually one of the Haitian scholars there actually spoke about how when it comes to Haitian immigrants, they were deported, comparing Biden's term and Trump's first term, Biden deported more Haitians than Trump, right? But at this, it's not by a lot. They both deported a lot. But this whole idea that we get them in and push them to the left, it just doesn't seem like a feasible strategy to me. I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Well, it's just, I think we need to change the entire political dynamic. My
Mm-hmm.
own opinion is, my own estimate is that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the retreat of socialist projects, that this created a Roman holiday for the ultra right. That's why you have Giorgio Meloni, a neo-fascist, as leader of Italy. By the way, she's probably the most anti-African leader on the continent, but when she visited the Oval Office in the summer of 2023, there was hardly a peep from any sector of the body politic. That's why you have the rise of the Alternative for Germany, the neo-Nazi party, which did quite well in the recent elections. Marine Le Pen, the leader of the right wing in France, did quite well in the July parliamentary
Did you
elections.
say the neo-Nazi party in Germany?
Oh yeah, Alternative for Germany, the AfD.
Wow.
Um, so, and of course, I need not remind you that many of our friends on the left were in the forefront of clamoring against then existing socialism for various reasons, and therefore they are somewhat culpable as the ecosystem politically has changed. Uh, Sorry about that.
No, you're fine. You're fine.
Um, and therefore it's led to the rise of the right wing,
Mm,
for example, in the United States of America. So then the question becomes, how do we change this overall global dynamic? That brings me back to my proposal that we need to have these conferences,
mm-hmm.
which, even setting aside the subject matter, deportations, reparations, police terror, blockade against Cuba for the one in Havana, that it'll just be monumentally profound for us to be under the same roof as envoys from abroad.
Absolutely.
This was what was necessary to destroy slavery, for example. So, as I said, we need to change the dynamic. We need to change the game.
Yeah, I think some people feel like, this is what it is and this is what it will always will be. And so they just, this idea, we've heard this word used a lot during this election, this idea of harm reduction, as if this lesser of two evils thing is actually viable for people, for African people and other quote unquote minorities in this country when we've been catching hell since we got here, right? And so I totally agree. We need an overhaul, a system overhaul, and I don't think anybody, you know, pushing the fact that we can push them to the left, no, it just doesn't seem like a feasible thing to me. Even if you did push them to the left, it kind of reminds me of in 2020 during the wake of the George Floyd protests, and when you like and Derek Bell's idea of interest convergence,
Mhm.
and how we got the funding DEI programs and other philanthropic things later to when we don't when we don't have that pressure on us, that those protest calls, hey, we roll it all back, right? And we see that's what's happening outside of immigration reform. How do you how do you see Trump's I guess Trump's term in office moving forward? I mean, what other ways outside of immigration reform do you see Donald Trump's term having an ill effect on African people and minorities in this country?
Well, first of all,
Hmm.
foreign policy.
Mm,
It's clear that the foreign policy will be to try to cut a deal with Russia over Ukraine so you can focus like a laser beam on China. Right now, a major aid provider to Africa and to a degree the Caribbean is China. Now, I've had disagreements with the People's Republic of China. I've even written about it, so I won't rehearse uh, those notions here because, you know, people carry these powerful computers in their pocket, but so maybe you should use it to look up something for
Right.
other than a rap lyric from time to time. So when Kamala Harris went to Africa, every airport she landed at, Accra, Ghana, Lusaka, Zambia, Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, was either subsidized or designed by Chinese interests. And so if Mr. Trump carries through with his idea to destabilize the Chinese Communist Party, which is a stated intention, the downstream consequences for Africa will be awful, not
Right.
least because it'll further empower the neo-colonial forces led by France, London, and the United States to dig their tentacles and claws into the continent. It's no accident, as historians like to say, that the last journey of Mr. Biden will be to Angola, not to pay homage to our ancestors who were dragged out of that Southwest African nations to toil for free, but to gain leverage against South Africa,
Hmm.
uh, which has taken Israel into the International Court of Justice, chief U.S. ally, on making a plausible case for genocide. South Africa, of course, is part of the BRICS. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa just co-opted Egypt, Ethiopia, and Nigeria, the most populous and the largest economy on the continent. It's presenting a stiff challenge to the U.S.-led order. Trump wants to destroy that. He's made it clear that he objects strenuously, as do other members of the U.S. ruling class, to their attempt to move towards a de-dollarization. As a matter of fact, in an article I'll be publishing next year, I'll be revising Du Bois's idea of double consciousness, because I think that idea was, this two warring ideals between being both U.S. and Africa. I think the problem in the 21st century will be double allegiances. That is
Mm.
to say, Africa is trying to break away from the U.S.-led order. Black Americans are in the United States. They supposedly pay fealty to Africa. But if they thought through the consequences of de-dollarization, for example, on their pocketbooks and on their income, for example, this is double allegiance is a real thing. And people need
Right.
to start thinking about it and start talking about it and thinking of a way out. But if history is any guide, that won't happen.
Um, One thing that I wanted to ask you, we talk about organizing, and you hear the frustration in many um, African people's issues with the white left, and how, in a lot of cases, you anything, this idea like that you mentioned earlier of identity politics, but not even just that, the idea that African people in America and uniting with the white working class, when the white working class as a whole, in a lot of cases, show that they have more of allegiance to white supremacy than their own pockets or their own freedom and justice. That seems like that's a tough task to ask any black man in America who is trying to organize. I mean, but what are your thoughts on this push, because I mean, obviously it's been a thing since the labor movement started, but the idea of organizing with the white working class when the white working class seems to have more of an allegiance to their own position in the social hierarchy in America than to ever, unite around issues of labor. I mean, what are your thoughts on that, as just from an organizing standpoint?
Well, the level of generalization, it brings me to reiterate my proposal, which is that in order to circumvent that problem you just outlined, we've had to lengthen the battlefield. That is to say, we internationalized the struggle against slavery, for example, at a time when London or Great Britain and the United States were at sword's point. You had Frederick Douglass spending months on end in London, for
mm,
example.
mm-hmm,
Paul Robeson, of course, spoke Russian and educated his only son in the Soviet Union. And of course, subsequently, Paul Jr. made a good living as a translator of Russian technical documents, for
mm,
example. That's how he
mm-hmm,
made a living. And so the problem you outlined is not a new one. But unfortunately, since the Compromise of 1954, anti-Jim Crow concessions in return for ditching internationalism, the idea of internationalizing the struggle has lost currency. And so what that means is that uh, many Black Americans say what you just said. Well, these Euro-American workers, I mean, you tell me to align with them, but they're racist. But then they don't move to point B, which is therefore I need to lengthen the battlefield. Or
mm,
it
mm-hmm,
just if you don't move to point B, well, I guess you should just go to the beach and get high
mm,
because and that's no way out, clearly.
right,
And
right,
so let me reiterate for the fourth time, NAACP should organize an international conference in Ottawa, Canada. They don't like Ottawa because it is sort of a dull town. Toronto or Montreal, because most of the major countries have consulates in those two cities if they don't have an embassy in Ottawa. Inviting not only the usual suspects, Cuba, Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, South Africa, Ghana, most African nations are represented in Canada, even France and the European Union, because they object to Trump tariffs.
mm-hmm,
A broad front against Trumpist fascism, focused in the immediate sense on halting deportations, in the longer sense on sanctions against U.S. imperialism until they retreat on the questions of police terror and reparations and blockade against Cuba. Assuming the NAACP does not accept that reasonable proposal, the All African People's Revolutionary Party and the African People's Socialist Party, which has a base in Florida, should organize a similar conference in Havana, Cuba. The very fact of us meeting under one roof will be of enormous significance, irrespective of how much progress we do or don't make on the substantive agenda.
absolutely. Dr. Horne, it's always an honor and a pleasure to build with you and talk with you. Thank you for all that you do. Thank you for continuing to help us understand where we are and historically to the present. And so again, thank you for coming on.
Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. You have a great night.